All right, so today we're diving into a pretty captivating question. What's the future of Islam in the 21st century?
Sounds intense.
Yeah, and to explore this, we're going to be looking at a YouTube video essay by the cyberpunk dingo called Why Islam Won't Survive the 21st Century, A Quiet Collapse. Have you seen this one?
Oh yeah, it's a pretty provocative piece.
It is. And one of the things that really grabbed my attention was the claim that the internet is more damaging to Islam than like 1,000 crusades.
Yeah, that's a pretty bold statement.
It is. And the video actually makes this a pretty compelling argument by drawing a parallel with the Protestant Reformation.
Right, it's looking at the impact of the printing press.
Exactly. So I'm curious to kind of unpack that a bit. Like, how does the printing press relate to the internet in this context?
Well, the video argues that the printing press was this like revolutionary technology that completely changed the game for religion.
Mm-hmm.
Back in the 15th century before the printing press, the Catholic Church pretty much had a monopoly on the Bible.
Oh, right, because
Well,
it was all in Latin?
exactly.
Mm.
Most people couldn't even read it. So the church had all the power to interpret it for everyone.
So the printing press kind of democratized access to knowledge in a way.
Yeah, you could say that suddenly Bibles could be mass-produced in local languages, so people could finally read and interpret Scripture for themselves.
Okay, so that makes sense. But how did this lead to the Protestant Reformation?
Well, this is where Martin Luther comes in. He starts criticizing the church, pointing out corruption and hypocrisy.
And because people could read the Bible for themselves.
Right? They could see for themselves whether what Luther was saying had merit, and his ideas just spread like wildfire thanks to the printing press.
So basically, the printing press empowered people to challenge the established religious authority.
Exactly.
But Islam came along later,
Right.
right? Did it go through a similar kind of upheaval?
Not really. The video argues that Islam actually managed to avoid this kind of reckoning with modernity for centuries.
Why is that?
Well, part of it has to do with how Islam has historically dealt with dissent and differing interpretations.
Like cracking down on anything that challenges the traditional views.
Yeah, pretty much.
Yeah,
Any deviation from the official interpretation was often met with very harsh consequences.
gotcha. Any specific examples of that from history?
Well, the video talks about the Ridda Wars, which happened right after the Prophet Muhammad's death.
The what wars?
The Ridda Wars.
Hmm.
They're also known as the Apostasy Wars. They were basically military campaigns to stop people from leaving Islam.
Wow, so they really weren't messing around.
Nope. And there's also this concept in Islam called bid'ah.
Bida.
Yeah, it basically means innovation in religious matters. And it's often used to discourage any kind of change or reinterpretation of Islamic teachings.
So it's like hitting the pause button on any kind of evolution within the religion.
Yeah, essentially.
Okay.
And the video argues that this resistance to adaptation is what ultimately made Islam vulnerable when the internet came along.
Right, because the internet is all about information sharing and challenging the status quo.
Exactly. It's like the printing press on steroids.
Okay, so how did the internet start impacting Islam specifically?
Well, one of the key things the internet did was create spaces for people to connect and share their ideas anonymously.
Right. You can be anyone online.
Exactly. And the video actually shares a personal story from Cyberpunk Dingo about how he discovered these online communities of ex-Muslims.
Really?
Yeah. These were spaces where people could openly discuss their doubts and criticisms of Islam without fear of reprisal.
That's important because in a lot of places, leaving Islam can still be really dangerous.
Absolutely. So these online spaces became like safe havens for people who might otherwise face serious consequences for just questioning their faith.
Makes sense. Are there any specific examples of these online communities?
Yeah, the video mentions Reddit's Rick Muslim community.
Hmm.
It has something like 400,000 members. And then there are all these hashtags on Twitter, like hashtag ex-Muslim and hashtag ex-Muslim, because
Wow. So it's a pretty big online movement.
it is. And it's not just about people leaving Islam. It's also about changing the conversation around the religion.
You mean like making it more acceptable to criticize Islam publicly?
Exactly. The video argues that the internet has made it much harder to suppress dissenting voices, and that it's really emboldened criticism and even satire of Islam.
I can see that. Like, think about those South Park episodes that satirize the Prophet Muhammad.
Right, or the Charlie Hebdo cartoons.
Yeah.
These were hugely controversial, but they definitely sparked a conversation.
They did, but wait a minute. Isn't Islam supposed to be the fastest growing religion in the world? How does that fit in with this whole quiet collapse idea?
That's a good point. And the video addresses that directly.
Yep.
It basically says that a lot of that growth is driven by high birth rates in developing countries, not necessarily by people converting to Islam.
So it's more about demographics than anything else.
Exactly. They point to countries like Niger, Somalia, Afghanistan, places with very high fertility rates,
Like, how high are we talking?
like 4 to 7 children per woman on average.
Wow, that's a lot.
It is. And these also often places with limited access to education and women's rights.
Which tend to be correlated with larger family sizes. But how does this tie back to the internet?
Well, even in these developing countries, the internet is becoming more and more accessible.
So people are getting exposed to different ideas and perspectives.
Yeah, and that can lead to people questioning traditional beliefs and values, including religious beliefs.
Interesting. So the internet's impact goes beyond just people leaving Islam. It's also influencing how Muslims themselves interpret the faith.
Right. And that's where this idea of an unintentional reformation comes in.
Unintentional reformation.
Yeah. The video argues that many Muslims are trying to make Islam more palatable to modern sensibilities.
I've seen that, like people saying Islam is feminist or Islam has no colonial past.
Exactly. And the video calls this the Reformation Muslims don't know they're leading.
That's a pretty catchy phrase.
Right. Because they're essentially reinterpreting Islam to fit with modern values, even if they're doing it to defend the religion.
It's like they're trying to square a circle in a way.
Yeah. And the video suggests that this might actually be laying the groundwork for a more progressive interpretation of Islam in the future.
Wow. So the internet could be driving a kind of evolution within Islam without Muslims even realizing it.
That's the argument.
Well, that's definitely food for thought. We'll have to dive deeper into all of this after the break.
Yeah, it really makes you think, like, what would a reformed Islam actually look like?
Right. What would it mean to have a more modern or liberal interpretation of the faith?
Tough questions. And the video doesn't really give us any concrete answers.
It doesn't.
No. But it does talk about some of the things that would need to happen for any kind of meaningful reform to take place.
Okay, like what?
Well, the video really emphasizes the importance of protecting free thought and freedom of speech.
Makes sense. You can't really have a genuine conversation or debate if people are afraid to speak their minds.
Exactly. And that's why the video is so critical of things like blasphemy laws and overly broad hate speech regulations.
Because they can be used to silence anyone who criticizes religion.
Right. And that ultimately hinders progress.
Mm.
It's like trying to put a lid on a boiling pot.
Yeah, eventually it's going to explode.
Exactly. And the video also makes this kind of controversial point about immigration.
Oh.
Yeah, it suggests that unchecked immigration into Western countries could actually undermine the very freedoms that are necessary for reform within Islam.
That's an interesting angle. How so?
Well, the argument is that some immigrants come from cultures where freedom of speech and religious criticism aren't really valued.
So if those values aren't upheld in the receiving countries.
Right. It could create a climate where it's harder to have those open and honest conversations about religion.
I see. So it's a bit of a double-edged sword.
Yeah, for sure.
Oh.
But the main point the video is trying to make is that preserving those fundamental freedoms is absolutely crucial for any kind of meaningful reform to happen.
Freedom of speech, freedom of thought.
Exactly. Those are the cornerstones.
So while political and social factors definitely play a role, the video ultimately sees the internet as the driving force behind this potential transformation within Islam.
Right? It's like the internet is this invisible hand shaping the future of a global religion.
It's a pretty mind-blowing concept when you think about it.
It is.
Yeah.
And it raises this really important question for all of us. If the internet has this much power to influence religious change, what's our responsibility in all of this?
As individuals.
Yeah. Do we just sit back and watch it happen? Or do we actively engage in these conversations and try to shape the future?
That's a good question, especially since we're all so connected online these days.
Right. Our online interactions, the content we consume, the platforms we support, it all has an impact.
So we're not just passive observers. We're active participants in this whole process.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that brings us back to that central question. What does all of this mean for the future of Islam? How will it change? How will it interact with the rest of the world?
Yeah. It's a big question with no easy answers.
Definitely. But it's a question worth thinking about. And that's what this deep dive is all about, getting us to think critically about these complex issues.
Absolutely. And I think the Cyberpunk Dingoes video does a great job of laying out the arguments and giving us a lot to ponder.
It does. And hopefully it sparks some curiosity in our listeners to learn more and to maybe even engage in some of these conversations themselves.
I hope so. All right, well, we've covered a lot of ground today, but there's still more to explore. We'll be right back after a quick break.
It's kind of wild to think about how something like the internet could actually be reshaping a major world religion.
It is pretty amazing when you think about it, like this intangible thing having a real impact on something as deep-rooted as faith.
And as we've been talking about, this impact isn't always going to be peaceful or harmonious.
Hmm.
There's bound to be friction and conflict as these different ideas clash.
Yeah, for sure. But the video actually makes the case that this friction is a good thing.
Oh, really? How so?
Well, it uses this metaphor of the immune system.
Okay, I'm intrigued.
So think about it. When your body encounters a foreign substance like a virus or bacteria, your immune system kicks into gear.
Right, you
Yeah.
get inflammation, maybe a
Hmm.
fever. It's not fun.
Yeah.
Exactly. But that whole process is actually what helps you build immunity and become stronger.
So you're saying these online debates and criticisms, even though they can be uncomfortable, they can actually make a religion more resilient in the long run?
Yeah, that's the idea. It's like by grappling with these tough questions and engaging with different perspectives, a religion can adapt and evolve and stay relevant.
But as we've seen with Islam, this process of adaptation isn't always easy. There's that constant push and pull between tradition and the desire for change.
For sure. And that tension is definitely going to continue as Islam navigates the digital age. The internet isn't a magic solution, but it's definitely changing the game.
It makes you wonder what role religious leaders will play in all of this. Like, are they going to embrace the changes or resist them?
Yeah, that's a big question. And while the video doesn't go too deep into that, it does suggest that religious leaders who cling too tightly to traditional interpretations might end up losing touch with younger generations.
Because those younger generations are growing up online, surrounded by all these different ideas.
Exactly. And
Yeah.
they're not going to just blindly accept whatever they're told.
So those religious leaders who refuse to adapt, they might end up like those old school companies that refuse to embrace the internet.
Yeah, they become irrelevant.
Exactly. They're stuck in the past.
And that brings us back to this idea that the transformation we're talking about isn't just happening to Islam. It's happening within Islam.
Right. It's not just some outside force acting on the religion. It's about Muslims themselves reinterpreting and evolving their beliefs.
And that's where the internet's impact could be the most significant.
Mm.
It's giving a voice to people who were previously silenced. It's creating spaces for dialogue and debate. It's empowering individuals to shape their own understanding of their faith.
So maybe this quiet collapse that the video talks about isn't about Islam disappearing altogether.
Yeah.
Maybe it's about the emergence of something new, something more fluid and adaptable.
That's a really interesting way to think about it.
Mm.
And ultimately, the video leaves us with more questions than answers.
Yeah.
But I think that's a good thing.
Yeah, it gets us thinking critically.
Exactly. And hopefully it inspires our listeners to keep digging deeper and exploring these complex issues.
Absolutely. Well, I think we've had a really fascinating conversation today. It's amazing to think about how something like the internet can have such a profound impact on something as fundamental as religion.
It really is.
Mm.
And it's something that we'll all continue to grapple with as we move further into the 21st century.
For sure. Well, that's all the time we have for today. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
It's been a pleasure.
And be sure to check back for more thought-provoking conversations in the future.